username in Slack is Nomadic. I'm in there every once in a while posting stuff. So let's see here. Okay, so quick overview. This isn't going to be a super crazy presentation. I'm just going to go over like the process flow, MDT, how BigFix plays into that, and just the pros and cons of it. So essentially what this is basically if you don't want to give a technician access to the console, or if you're like us and we don't have full access to our console because our parent company manages it, you can do thin imaging. Basically what that is we're utilizing MDT to do the imaging process, and then after MDT finishes its imaging, then BigFix takes over. So you can kind of see that in this. We have two separate machines that we use. So we have a point of sale and we have a back office, and we've actually built into BigFix to make that switch. So there's two separate baselines for those images. Basically, so the first part, I mean, in MDT, so the imaging process. So basically, you just got to pick your operating system, whatever it may be. We're using Windows 10. You can still do 7, I guess, if you wanted, but there's Windows 10 stuff. So you pick your image, and then in MDT, there's a lot of stuff that you can do. You have access to run command lines. You can install applications and stuff like that. This is kind of, if you've never been in there, this is what you would see when you do like a sequence. Basically, it's kind of like a baseline. It's just what happens in order when the imaging process starts. So the idea would be when you're creating this task sequence is you would probably want BigFix in there so that it checks in once it's done imaging. You may want some other type of remote access tools built into there, and then maybe some AV or something, whatever else you want to be 1000% sure that it's there. So again, I kind of reiterate that here. So create your image, select what you're going to do. You go to the machine and you deploy it. So basically how we do it is we have it built in AWS. We manage retail locations all over the US. We have tons of them. So we're able to basically log into that AWS server from that machine and kick off the imaging process from that machine. And then the capture portion, when you create the image, so you want BigFix and stuff like that. The other option would be to deploy that base image, that Windows 10 image, install BigFix, install whatever else you want on there, and then capture that. And then it doesn't even have to be a task. It'll just be part of that image, part of that win. So again, that's the MDT portion, but we're here for BigFix. So just to kind of go over this, show you guys that again, the BigFix portion. I will say that when you're doing this, if you have to be PCI compliant or anything like best practice, I would highly, highly, highly suggest documenting everything, whether it be your BigFix tasks and what order they're in, each separate baseline, however you want to do it, but do it while you're building the image because you don't want to go back and build it. It kind of sucks and takes a long time. What I used, it's free. I just used Trello. I could just create a little card and then I can move them around as I moved them around in my baseline. So in that shared baseline, essentially what I'm doing is I'm increasing the CPU usage that BigFix is using. Nobody's on that machine, so I don't have to worry about it taking up too much CPU. I'm changing, this will be like, since we have two separate images, you're going to be essentially applying things that both images would get, right? It's a shared thing. So power settings, creating your user profiles, whatever that may be, disabling administrator, creating a separate administrator. If you want them all to have the same wallpaper or screensaver, disabling applications that you know are going to be on both images, drivers, because you may not want Bluetooth active or Wi-Fi or whatever you want. You can just disable those now. And then the most important part is the last piece, that unique text file. So for us, we have Relevance that essentially it looks at the computer name and it will create a blank text file with indicating what kind of PC that is, whether it be a point of sale or an office computer. And then the next piece of the Relevance is essentially looking for that text file and it's saying, hey, that's a point of sale. I'm going to kick off this other baseline. and I'm going to do all the things that are associated to that specific computer. So if it's a point of sale, you may have a separate set of tasks than you might have if it was an office computer. And that text file is that differentiator essentially. And then if you're basically based on that, so if MDT for whatever reason doesn't activate Windows, I added another task just to make sure it's active, because sometimes it happens, or if licensing ends or whatever the case may be, then you can still reapply it with BigFix.
There's actually quite a bit of, there's quite a bit of content out there on BigFix Me around measuring whether or not Windows is activated and how it's activated, and actually changing the activation method as well, which is pretty cool.
Interesting. I did not know that, so that is good to know. And then you can also do, so you're installing specific stuff to the machine, applications, whatever the case may be. You might be limiting access to a point of sale machine, but on certain applications, and then your office machine, I don't know, might have Office, right? You might have Microsoft Office, but you don't want that on your point of sales, for instance. So in those different baselines, you would specify that, you would add it or remove it. Customizations, we're using 2 separate images. So when you go from like LTSB to like Enterprise, there's a bunch of extra junk in Enterprise that LTSB doesn't have. So you're essentially rebuilding it and customizing things to work with that image. And then the next part, I choose to do security baselines at the end. And the reason being is just so that it doesn't interfere with any installations or anything like that. That's my personal preference. You could do it in the beginning, but again, and that's where you're going to decide based on your company and on your company's needs. Are you going to go with NIST? Are you going to go with CIS? Are you going to go with STIG? And there's tons of tools out there, and BigFix has their compliance stuff that will help you with this. But if you were to go a separate route, then you can do that. But you definitely want to have a security baseline built into that. And then last thing, you decrease your CPU usage, because when the user is using the machine, you don't want it just hogging up all that CPU usage. And then what I do, just to make sure like no one's messing with the machine while it's actually running, is when I initially create the accounts, I'll set a random password, and then at the end it will set the password that I want it to have, keeps the user out, and then if they ever wonder, hey, is it done or whatever, then if they can access it, then it's done, essentially.
Do you put any sort of indicator on the system to say it's not ready yet for user access?
I don't. We've talked about essentially changing, because the lock screen, you could change the lock screen and just say like imaging or something like that. And then right before it finishes, you could change the lock screen picture to something different, like the normal lock screen picture.
Yes.
So that's definitely an option. We're being lazy and decided to not go that route.
So
but you could totally do it.
So at Penn State University, we followed a very similar practice. We did thin imaging with MDT, kind of like you're describing, actually, I don't even know if we used MDT, but it was very, very similar idea. But we actually set the lock screen to have like a stop sign to say like, don't log in, this is not ready for you, and like we're not even going to let you log in for the most part. And then we would go through a bunch of baselines and then reboot the system. And before that reboot, we would change the lock screen to another image. And that would say, okay, now you can log in, but not everything's quite done. And then we would run through some more baselines, and then we would have another reboot. And before that final reboot, we'd set that lock screen to say the normal lock screen, and it's like everything's good to go. And so that was our indication that users cannot log in, users can log in, but everything's not quite finished, and now everything's finished.
Yeah, so you can absolutely do that. We did discuss that. It was just a matter of, okay, do we want to mess with this and do this? But it wasn't that big an issue, because for us, I think we're going to be doing a lot of imaging at night, right before the stores close. So by the time they come back in, it should be done, theoretically, right? So after that, essentially, basically what we're doing is just cleanup. So you're deleting that unique text file. You don't need it. So I leave it. And then the main thing is you're switching that location. So something I probably should have mentioned is when you image the machine with MDT, you set the location, or at least that's how we're doing it. We have a specific group created for imaging. So when the machine checks in, it hits that group, Then if that machine hits specific criteria, then it will hit the specific baseline. And then that, based on what type of machine it is, it will hit a separate baseline. But then we also, when it's finished, want it to go to our main location where all of our other machines are. So once the baseline finishes, the last thing is you switch that location, and then you reboot the machine to apply all of your security baselines, all your group policies, all of your registry edits, everything, just to make sure everything applies correctly, however you're doing it. And then as far as, so pros and cons. So, I mean, obviously through BigFix, it's a lot easier just to image this. But again, if you don't have access, then you got to find a workaround. So the pro of this, I mean, you get to limit access to the console. A tech could essentially log into this machine, go to the IP of the AWS server and launch that specific VBS script, and it will kick off imaging. And once it checks in, BigFix will do its thing. So they don't have access to that, which is pretty cool. You still get to image with BigFix and MDT, which BigFix, I don't know if you guys know, but BigFix does use MDT on the back end in the imaging process. So that's pretty cool. They're both very powerful tools, so why not use them? So I just restated that. And then you can image PCs anywhere. All of our machines, they're all over the world. Or not all over the world, but all over the US. We literally have stores in every single state. So makes it a lot easier. One of the cons is, again, it's not done through BigFix. BigFix is probably way easier. Easy mode, you can click it and tell it to do it, and it just does it. And then it takes a little bit more to set up. You got to build your MDT server. You got to capture all your images. You have to do all of that. You have to build all your tasks in BigFix, and it is a process. But it's not too painful. It's just doing the work, and it's nothing too crazy. And then it's a little bit slower of an imaging process. I don't know. Again, I can't really compare it to imaging through BigFix, but I can say, like, you run it through MDT, you wait for it to check into BigFix and all that. It does take some time, depending on how big your baselines are. But I will say that it is, I should have added this to a pro, it is, in my opinion, way more efficient to image things this way, because you don't have these massive files that you're trying to image a computer with, because you're trying to download everything all at once. It allows you to customize those tasks. So if you just decide, hey, you know what, we don't want Chrome on these machines anymore, you can just remove the task and you don't have to worry about rebuilding and capturing an image. So that's huge in my opinion, because it allows you to do it on the fly. And other than that, that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, please go ahead and ask questions. I did want to add on to this a little bit. What some people do is they kind of have, like, they go more towards a thin imaging process over time. So they do less and less in MDT and do more and more in BigFix or similar. But one of the ways you can get some of the performance back of doing a thicker image style is you can actually have a build process that kicks off and takes your existing stuff, and it looks at all of you, and actually looks at all of your actions that you're going to deploy through BigFix to those machines. So, like, at that group and that targeting that you have, you can grab all the prefetches that are in all of those actions and then actually pre-cache them inside the image that you're deploying with MDT. So you can actually pre-cache the downloads that are current through BigFix. And so you can actually kick off this build like once a day and have an image that you deploy, and it has the downloads already in the image. So it takes a little bit longer in the initial imaging process, but the downloads are already there. And this is something that's becoming more and more common. So it's actually like a hybrid between like a thick image and a thin image in that sense. Like, it's still doing a thin imaging style, but it's doing it much faster than it would otherwise take. Scott asks...
So you're capturing all of your downloads on the image first, essentially.
Yes, so capturing what's currently active in BigFix. So that way, if you go and change it later, then the next day the image build process spits out a different image with different downloads in it. So you still get the flexibility of managing it all after the fact. So if you take out a download or an install out of BigFix, it won't get installed, but it'll still be in the image until you update that image. So if someone uses an out-of-date image, they'll still get the newest software installed, every time, but their imaging process will be slightly slower than it would have been otherwise. Scott asks, how do you kick off the imaging process? Yeah, how do you guys do it?
So right now, we are basically just logging into the machine and then logging into AWS and running that VBS script. I haven't had the time, but I would like to automate this a lot further to the point where it's like grabbing the current machine name and I can deploy it on mass level. But right now, it's just logging in and selecting that script.
So some people do this with USB keys or ISOs or PXE. Like once you have this stuff built up, you can actually do it many different ways. There's a lot of flexibility there. The way we did it at Penn State University is we could not rely on DHCP. We could not rely on PXE booting in all cases. So we actually had a script that someone would run, and it would build a USB key for them with the most recent image and all the stuff in it. And then you would hit it with the machine. It would boot to a WinP environment. And you'd fill out a little bit of information, and you could have some of that pre-filled if you wanted. And then it would save a copy of that USB key to a hidden partition on that machine, and then it would reboot. And so the whole time took about 5 minutes, but once it rebooted, you could pull out the USB key and go to the next one. But when it reboots, what it's actually doing is rebooting into that hidden partition and re-imaging the system from there, not from the USB key directly, but from the copy of the USB key that was saved with the info. And then what's cool about that is you could remotely, once the build was done, send a command through BigFix to say, make that hidden partition active again, and now reboot into that and start the whole process over again. So you could actually remotely re-image your machines using this method, all using like the same image that you could deploy through, ISO or USB or PXE if you had the ability in your environment. But we did all of the above, basically, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot of possibilities there. All right, any other questions about this topic or any other topic? I don't know if you have any other comments, Damon.
The only thing I would say is just in MDT is just keep your image updated. It saves you from having to wait for updates to happen. You just create that image, update it, and then every time Patch Tuesday comes out, just basically update it, recapture it. And that'll just keep your image at its most up-to-date current state.
Yep.
Other than that, I don't have anything else if anyone doesn't have any more questions.
Sounds good. One thing I wanted to bring up that's related to this, let me see if I can find it. So one of the things you want to do whenever you're doing this kind of imaging process is you generally want things to go as fast as possible. Oh, someone says LTSC 2019 was released today. Interesting. So if you want things to go as fast as possible with BigFix, where you're doing these kind of installs, there's various things you can do to optimize the settings. So Damon mentioned increasing the CPU usage of the BigFix client, which is certainly one way to do it. There's actually a few other settings I would recommend that I have out there that I could talk about as well. But another one is you can delay BigFix site subscription for various sites until your initial provisioning is finished. And so how you may do that, or one possibility here, is this relevance right here, minima of subscribe time of sites. This approximates when BigFix is installed and first talking to BigFix successfully. So it should be the subscribe time of the action site generally, but it's basically this is measuring like how long has BigFix been installed, which is this right here. And then this is saying the amount of time it's been installed is was this greater than 6 hours. So the idea is that you can copy and paste this relevance and actually put it into your site subscription criteria, and you can actually have BigFix sites that will not be relevant on the machine and they will not process until this criteria is met. One example is like all the patching stuff in BigFix. So you might not want the system to start patching or evaluating patches until you're finished installing everything and then kick off a patch process. So the idea here is you can have it not bother with that content and significantly speed up the performance of doing all of your initial stuff. Like generally for me, I want my security configuration, my initial application installs, and all this stuff to like get it ready for the user, and then I want to start patching later. And you can also have a tag that happens at the very last baseline that Damon talked about, where that very last thing in the last baseline would tag the system as finished with initial provisioning. And so then that could make this timeout happen quicker. So instead of waiting the full 6 hours, you may wait less. And so I have a bunch of different recommendations for some that you may not need right away, including like patching sites. And if you have custom content sites that systems don't need to worry about right away, you can do that as well. And so I should have an example in here somewhere where my external sites should be set up this way somewhere. Patches for Windows, computer subscription. You can actually see it right here. So I'm actually putting a 3-hour delay on patches for Windows inside my console. Hopefully you can see that. That's a little small text-wise. I don't know if I can change that. Oh yeah, I can. Hey, how about that? There, it's bigger. So there, I'm putting a 3-hour delay. So did you know about this, Damon? Have you done anything like this?
I did not. So essentially, you're basically telling it don't patch until my imaging process is done.
Well, it's not even that, but I'm also saying don't bother evaluating all the content in this site at all. So there's these 13,000 fixlets in it, and it doesn't actually evaluate all of these individually in these external sites, which is something else we talked about at the masterclass, this most recent masterclass. But the whole idea is like don't have it bother with these until I'm done, because I really care more about how quickly the user can log in and start using the machine, and I don't need it to start patching right away. Or if I do want it to start patching, I want that to happen towards the end of everything, and so you can control that. So for instance, like this BES inventory and license, maybe you do want that information right away. So maybe you don't want to put a delay in, or maybe you don't care about it, so you do put a delay in. So you can actually have the computer not subscribe to that content right away and not bother with it, in which case it will get through things much quicker, which is pretty cool. And you talked about having your system go from like a patching site or a patching group and then leave that group and go into your normal process. Well, that's kind of doing the same thing for that content. But you could actually have it so those computers don't subscribe to some of your other custom sites at all until that criteria is met. So for instance, I don't know what a good one here. Maybe this Dell content here. Well, maybe not. Power management, no. I don't know. I don't know what a good example is in my stuff that I have, but like let's say there was one of these I didn't want my computers to subscribe to. I might like have them not subscribe to this one until that provisioning is completed, and then they would subscribe to it later. So you can divide up content that way, and to get a performance boost. Another piece that is cool. So this is my GitHub. I think it's in here. I worked on a bunch of content to set BigFix settings for speeding things up, essentially. So I really designed this to be safe for anyone to deploy in their environment, regardless of their situation. So what this one does here is it sets all of these settings only if it's not currently set. So it basically says if there is no resource startup normal speed set, then set it to 1. If there's no download retry set, then set it to 1. So the idea is in the MDT process, when you're installing BigFix, you can use a client settings.cfg file to pre-populate BigFix settings and get it going faster, rather than just installing BigFix. In fact, what some people do is they install BigFix at the very end of the MDT sequence that Damon was talking about, But they actually install BigFix in such a way that it does not start. So it doesn't start running, and then they reboot at the very end of the MDT task sequence. And what that does is it causes BigFix to run for the first time at the first reboot after everything's completed on the MDT side. Then BigFix kicks in, and if you have the client settings.cfg file populated, then BigFix picks up settings right away. First time it ever runs, it picks up a whole bunch of settings that you can set in there to make it faster, more optimal. And like this is definitely one of them that I would recommend for sure in there. But if you don't have a client settings.cfg file, or you have people installing BigFix in many different ways, they're not going to have these settings pre-populated. So the idea is you can send this out to all computers in your environment and basically get initial settings on those systems only if they're not currently set. So you can allow someone to override what you think those settings should be by using their own client settings.cfg or using their own BigFix actions after the fact. But the idea is you're basically saying if these settings are not set anywhere, then I'm going to set them. And so when you're talking about doing thin imaging through BigFix, some of these are very important, like download retry minutes. It used to be 1 minute, but now it's something else. And the way this works is it tries at 1 minute, and if the download fails, then it tries 2 minutes, and then if it fails again, it tries 4, and then 8, and then 16, and 32. So it actually backs off its retries. It used to be 1 minute was the default, and I think they changed it to something higher. So I strongly recommend you set that to 1 minute. There's a download cache limit. So if you're pushing a bunch of software through BigFix through a thin imaging process or any process, you definitely want to set the download cache to be higher. Command polling, I think, is a must. Everyone should have command polling enabled. It's just a matter of how often you have it and do command polling. This sets the log days to 30 days, so keep 30 days of BigFix logs. This is incredibly helpful because otherwise you have the logs roll off and someone reports a problem and you don't get to it fast enough, and so then there's no log information. I also set the log size to be bigger because the default is 512 kilobytes. I'm setting it to 1.5 megs basically. So you're talking about a maximum of like 45 megabytes worth of logs, which in modern day hard drives is not that big a deal. I don't know if that's true for your point of sale systems, Damon. Like how much hard drive space are you working with often?
I think most of them are 500 gigs.
Okay, so that's not a problem. I mean, we hear that, some people have embedded systems and they have small hard drives and they worry more about space, and that's why BigFix is pretty conservative about its defaults for all this stuff. But I think it's a little too conservative with the defaults. It's also a utility cache limit, wake on LAN forwarding. There's another download check availability seconds, which I think should be 1 or 2 minutes in that range. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that I think are good settings to set, and I actually have this designed so that these don't change depending on what's going on. I would actually use a separate action to change certain settings to be more aggressive initially and then less aggressive later through a combination of client settings.cfg or baselines and other states. Any other questions about enhancing the performance of BigFix or other related things? If computers are deleted or hidden from view in the console but not yet purged, is there a significant performance impact to the master server? So this is a question that I just got. So if you delete a computer or hide it, or like globally hide it in the console, that does actually improve performance for all the operators that can no longer see it. It improves console performance, it improves performance in lots of different areas. So deleting or globally hiding things is beneficial for performance, but there is a little bit of a performance hit by having stuff that's deleted but still in the BigFix database, because the database still has to handle it, it still has to process it, it's still there. So you do want data to be purged from the server eventually, and there's scheduled things that you can add to the BizAdmin utility to have it automatically clean up the database. So you can have it clean up things that have been deleted for more than 30 days, and you can have that run like once a day or once a week or whatever you want. So it's definitely value of cleaning things up. says context was VDI run amok creating duplicate computers. So one issue that you can have is duplicate computers can get created if the machine doesn't really save state on reboot or various other causes many computers to appear. And there's actually a new correlation feature in BigFix that can actually handle this case and can try to give the new what BigFix sees as like a newer version of that machine the old computer ID and prevent this duplication from happening. Yes, John Talbert says client identity matches your friend. So that's what it's called. I always forget about that. I heard it as like the correlation feature, but it's actually client identity match. So this works if like if you take a machine and you clone it multiple times and you run them simultaneously, this isn't going to fix that for you. But if you do have the same computer reappearing at different times, but it's like effectively the same computer, this will help solve it. And so it's something you set in Baseline, and it's generally a good idea for people to use. So this has some of the information about it. That is not how I search that. Client identity. Well, it should be in here somewhere. But you set client identity match to 1 in BezAdmin, I believe. I don't know why.
It's towards the bottom.
It's towards the very bottom. It is new. Somewhere in here. There it is. Oh, it's capital I. Is that my problem? Well, that's weird. Why was it case sensitive? So, whoops. This is the setting right here. So in BezAdmin, you can add client identity match. I guess you add it to 100. So it does, and the BigFix root server does additional checking to determine whether or not it should give the computer a new computer ID, which determines whether or not it duplicates in the console. So if you have a use case where clients are duplicating frequently because you're using something like deep freeze or your VDI or something else, you should definitely enable this setting because using BezAdmin to clean up the aftermath is still going to cause additional load on the root server all the time just because it has a bunch of extra entries in there that it shouldn't have or doesn't need to have. So this will actually proactively prevent that and cause better performance more of the time than just cleaning it up afterwards. So another question from Keenan. Is there any way to force BigFix to use the serial number or some UUID of the physical virtual machines instead of the UUID that BigFix creates? So, I mean, that's kind of what this does, actually. So the client identity match, what it does is it looks for unique UUIDs on the system to correlate the fact that it matches from the computer ID. And I think it does some other logic to determine whether or not this appears to be a unique registration. This actually happens during the registration process. And so that's effectively what it's doing. But BigFix will still assign the computer a unique computer ID in BigFix. So it's still going to assign it, but it would be nice if we could more easily expose what we're considering the unique UUID of the system in this correlation feature and provide that to you so that you could use that externally. I mean, we could write some relevance that pulls the same information, I'm sure, but we don't provide it out of the box, so that's a bummer. Pete asks, we have multiple departments that have their own admins within BigFix. At any time, there could be upwards of 30 admins logged into the console. Use local users, so we could restrict a login timeout on the admin tool. Now users use LDAP and ignore this setting. Is the performance of the server directly affected by the number of logged in users? And if so, how can we set inactivity timeout for LDAP users? So yes, the more users that you have using the Windows console at a time, even if they aren't actually touching the console at all, it does impact the root server performance and affects the performance of all the other consoles out there. And that's where you get into needing to increase the console refresh to lower that cost. So at Penn State University, when I worked there, what we did is we forced all operators to log in through a terminal server. Some people use Citrix or other methods to do the same. And that terminal server had a 10 gig connection back to the root server and database in the data center, so that there was as fast a performance and lowest latency as possible between the two. We also put fast disks in the terminal server that were not under RAID, like an NVMe disk, and that's where we put the console cache, or turn off caching. Either one is an option. And if the cache disk dies, we don't care because we're not losing any data. So using very fast disks for that. And we would kick the sessions in that terminal server session if they were like idle for, let's say, an hour or something like that. And then that would reduce the number of idle sessions in the terminal server that have the console open. The other thing that you can do is use the web UI. So if you use the web UI, it does not refresh against the root server constantly the same way the Windows console does. So we actually have some customers that are quite large that are pushing their operators to use the web UI all the time and use the Windows console some of the time, or never, hopefully. But that's, we don't have a quite feature match in both places yet. But the idea is that if you have the web UI sitting open and you're not using it, it doesn't really impact the root server. But if you have the Windows console sitting open and you're not using it, that does impact the root server. So that is another option to enhance performance. 30 admins at a time is a lot with the console open. At Penn State, we frequently had 100 Windows consoles open at a time, and that could be quite painful at times. We did a lot of things to help mitigate that and got it better, including like upgrading the performance on our database server and a bunch of other stuff. But it could always be better than it was, that's for sure. Any other questions? Some good questions so far. And more people joining. That's cool. More people than at the start, it seems. I don't have any open questions at the moment. One setting that I feel like a lot of people probably don't know about that I also strongly recommend, especially when in steady state, there is something called BigFix Client Resource Power Save Enable. And what this does is it actually tells the BigFix client to not use the CPU at all. So generally what BigFix client does is it uses 2% of CPU all the time, just nonstop, to evaluate relevance. What the Power Save Enable does is it says if nothing's changing, if you're evaluating the relevance loop and you don't see changes happening, then just stop evaluating for 10 minutes. Use 0% CPU for 10 minutes, and then wake back up, do the evaluation loop once again, and if things aren't changing, then go back to sleep for another 10 minutes, and then just keep that going. And so the idea is that this actually allows BigFix to use 0% CPU most of the time, which is pretty cool, and actually is a major benefit to for VMs, Docker containers, laptops, anything that uses battery power or has many different systems on the same host. So I strongly recommend this to use it basically all the time, and it has very little negative consequence, because if the machine gets a UDP message from BigFix that there's something new to do, or does a gather or something like that, and it finds new stuff, then it kicks out of this mode and goes back into the regular mode automatically, so you don't really lose much. Keenan asks, does anyone know of a syntax highlighter for relevance/action script? I mean, obviously the console does that as well, but there's something out there called highlight.js, and it's a JavaScript framework for doing syntax highlighting, and that's actually what the BigFix forum uses and other things use. And so that has, I think, someone wrote a plugin for it that will do some of that syntax highlighting for you using highlight.js. Ideally, that plugin or that thing for highlight.js would be enhanced so that it does the full syntax highlighting that the console and Fixlet debugger and all of these things do. That would be perfect. Would be ideal. But one thing that is interesting is if you This isn't like a good answer exactly, but let's grab something in here. So if I come in here and grab all of this like this and copy this out, I mean, I guess BigFix Me does it also. And I don't know, where would I paste this? Maybe here. No, it's not going to work. Oh, I know what I'm trying to do. If I come in here and I go to View Source, if I can find the actual relevance in here, which is it's actually kind of a mess. Yeah, so here, relevance keyword, collapsed code. Yeah, so somewhere in here is like the view of the relevance with a bunch of decorators around it in HTML, and then there's actually CSS and other stuff that actually makes it look that way. So I mean, you could actually reverse engineer how all this works, which I think is what BigFix Me basically does, and it shows you all this stuff, and then it has a JavaScript thing to toggle the indent and unindent of it. So you can click this little indent thing and unindent, and it'll change the look of the relevance automatically. That's kind of what BigFix Me does, is it reverse engineers that process and re-implements it. So that would be possible as well. But ideally, you would have something like Highlight.js that would be a little bit more, I don't know, modular and portable. They could use anywhere. And then what would be ideal is to then add that capability to something like Notepad++ or Visual Studio Code or other things like that. So that was actually a request, is creating like a plugin for Visual Studio Code that would do relevance and ActionScript syntax highlighting, which would be great. And so there is somewhere, I don't even know where this is, like on GitHub or something, there's like TextMate, I think. I don't know. BigFix Relevance TextMate plugin. Somewhere someone out there actually made like a plugin to do this, and like I think it's TextMate that has like a plugin architecture that handles like syntax highlighting and other stuff like that, and then things like Sublime Text can actually use the same plugin architecture, which is pretty cool. So yeah, tackled that. Yeah, so that's absolutely been brought up. Someone hopefully out there will tackle a Notepad++ or VS Code plugin. Yes. So ideally, it would be done using like Highlight.js, make that work really well, and then Highlight.js could be in a Visual Studio Code plugin, because Visual Studio Code will run JavaScript. One of the questions: would the power save enable on the client make them show as offline in the console? No, it will not. So using the power save enable setting in the client does not affect how often the client sends a heartbeat or sends a report through BigFix. So that would prevent them from being offline. So let me look at this. Well, here, there is preferences in the console. So send heartbeat every whatever minutes. This tells the client computers that if you had nothing else to do, you have nothing to report into BigFix, then send a report anyway with just nothing in it, at least this often, to let BigFix know that you're still alive. And then if it hasn't come in for this often, then mark as offline. So in a bigger environment, you may want to set the heartbeat to something higher, something closer to like, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes in that range, and then mark offline after to something higher like an hour. But this mark offline thing, it's just an approximation. It's not like a real solid given thing. It's not a certainty. So you might want to make these higher, and by making the heartbeat higher, you are lowering some of the load on your relays by having the client send things through the relays less often. Yes, Keenan, code completion would be awesome as well for relevance and ActionScript, and I feel like Leeway may have a utility that did something like that at some point. There's also this is relevant to this question. Somewhere there is a dashboard that helps you write relevance, or a wizard or something rather. I don't remember where. Relevance Builder. Hey, there it is. Relevance Builder. Oh, it uses Flash. Well, crap. Never mind what I just said. Anyway, so this Relevance Builder dashboard, it has like a UI, and it has like drop downs and stuff, and you like put stuff in it, and then it spits out a relevance thingy down here. But I can't show you on this system, so lovely. That did not do what I wanted. Nope, that's not what I want. But anyway, so there is a thing to kind of help you write relevance. But definitely one of the best ways to write relevance is to look at good examples that are out there. Oh, Keenan wants to show it really quick. All right. How do I make him presenter? Let's do this. I like this. But yeah, are you guys finding this useful, this online Q&A, while I'm switching over to Keenan? Okay. So my goal with this session is to try to do this at least once a quarter, and at least once a quarter, and hopefully to have like a customer presentation or something. So do a little bit of Q&A in the beginning while we're waiting for people to show up, and then once everyone, get some people joining, then to hopefully do like a 5 to 10, maybe 15-minute presentation at most. I'm hoping for like 10 minutes or less, and ideally from like a customer or a different person each time on something like we had Damon do, and then go back to like Q&A and kind of fill the time from there, and I can show off cool stuff that I'm working on, or other people can. But really the goal for this is to do as much Q&A as possible. So you should be able to see Keenan's screen right now, and so he's showing this client relevance builder thingy-majiggy, and you can just like put stuff in it. You can hit the little plus sign. It's not going to make you the most efficient relevance necessarily, but it is very, very flexible, and it does allow you to build relevance statements in a pretty amazing way. And so it is also a good place to start when you don't exactly know what you're doing necessarily. And then this combine expressions area, you can switch it from like and to or, and it'll actually change like what's down there below, which is pretty neat. And putting parentheses around it to change the process order of the statements. So it is actually a very powerful tool. It doesn't let you build like any possible statement. I mean, it's a little bit limited, but it's actually a really good place to start. And then what you can do is you can take this relevance that you pull out of here and stick it in a property or an automatic group, and you can see, if you put it in an automatic group, you'll see what computers come back as relevant, and then you can kind of review what computers show up in that automatic group. And if those computers seem like the right ones that you're looking for, then hurrah, huzzah, you got what you wanted. But if the computers that show up in the automatic group are not the ones you're looking for, then the statement's not quite working. But one of the great ways to test this is to create an analysis, add a property to it that says like, attempt number 1 of whatever, and then copy and paste this relevance in there, and then you'll get a true for all the ones that it's applicable for, and a false for the ones that it's not. And then you can add another property and tweak it and try it again, and put some new relevance in there that you've built, and try that again until you get trues from all the systems you think should be true and false for all the systems that you think should be false. And then it's working the way you want, and then you can plop it into a fixlet or an automatic group or a site subscription criteria, like if you have a custom site just for certain groups. So there's a lot of different possibilities here, but you can start with this and go from there, do more complicated things. It's a pretty cool tool. I would recommend checking it out. You do have to enable BigFix Labs in your license dashboardy thingy if you don't have that enabled, and then you have to go into BigFix Labs and enable stuff. So yeah, I guess unless Keenan has something else to show. Yep. So I have this scheduled to run till 2, but I probably will not run this whole session until 2 unless there's, a bunch of more questions coming in. I actually used to do this exact same sort of thing for at Penn State University on a semi-regular basis. At Penn State University, we actually had 350 console operators. So we did a lot of internal documentation and training, and we had once a year we had basically an internal user group for all of our console operators. We had mandatory training in order to become a console operator, so you could not become a console operator at Penn State unless you took a mandatory class and passed our training. If you were not active within BigFix, then we disabled your account, and then if you were not active for a while longer, then we deleted your account. If your account was deleted, we would often require that your manager reapprove your access to BigFix. So, your manager had to approve your access to BigFix in the first place, but we would require them to get approvals again and potentially even pass the class again. So we put some penalties in for essentially not keeping up on your BigFix-ness. And part of that is just because of having so many console operators. And we had to do what we could to try to manage things as best as possible. Well, I guess if there's no more questions, we're at about an hour, which I think is a pretty good time. Has anyone checked out the new patch compliance feature in SCA from John Talbert? Patch compliance. I have not checked that out very much, but we did talk about that at the London user group. I'm not super familiar with that, but yeah, I think it's just patch compliance reporting of machines over time in SCA, which is cool. Also, I recorded the session. I didn't start it until Damon started talking. Let me know if you're uncomfortable with the recording, or if that would prevent you from asking questions or anything like that. I may eventually post the recording somewhere, but I'm definitely going to check with Damon and others before doing that. I would love to record and post everything all the time, but I also would potentially have sessions that are intentionally not recorded so people can feel a little more free to ask questions. Yeah, I would definitely prefer the idea of recording where possible. And, if you ask questions over the chat, I don't think that's going to show up in the recording, and I can, not publicize your name, or please put in an anonymized name if you don't want that to be publicized. So, I hope to have sort of a way for people to ask questions that aren't comfortable with recording, but still have them be able to ask the questions and not have it be tied to them if that's the case. So I'm trying to do a mix there. Okay, so Martin is asking, with the addition and deletion of console operators, I have a significant performance issues with the evaluation of new systems. Any way to deal with this? Absolutely, that there are ways to deal with this, Martin. So first of all, you do not want to delete console operators quickly. You want to first disable their account, and then you want to wait a while and then delete their account. You want to delete their account much later, and the reason for this is if you have to recreate the exact same operator again, that negatively impacts BigFix in terms of performance, especially with the initial clients getting going. So I did mention, where did I put that? Somewhere. How did this end up over here? So there are ways to speed up the initial provisioning in BigFix. So I talked about in here somewhere this thing that you can deploy. So this one right here, deploy it to all your systems as an open action, so it'll go right away and it'll boost the speed of stuff. The better way to do that is to use what's called a client settings.cfg file. And so I have an example of a client settings.cfg file out there somewhere. And so what you do for the case of Windows and Mac is you install the BigFix agent with a client settings.cfg file in the same folder. And this will actually pre-populate the client settings right away, right from the beginning. And this right here actually makes the biggest difference by far. If you set this setting and no other, you'll have a huge performance improvement. And what this tells it to do, it tells the Bez client, for the very first time when you kick off, pretend like you're in what's called normal speed until you've finished a full evaluation loop, or until the evaluation loop settles down, and then switch back to idle mode. So the way BigFix works is by default it uses 2% of CPU in idle mode, and it uses 50% of CPU of one this is 2% of one CPU or 50% of one CPU in normal mode by default. So this tells BigFix, when I install you for the very first time, run in normal mode, and then what happens is it'll actually switch this to 0 automatically. BigFix itself will. So you set this to 1, it runs in normal mode, and then it sets this back to 0. And this makes a massive difference, because then the BigFix agent can process through all the offsite relevance and subscribing operators to the client very, very quickly, way quicker than it would otherwise, which is a big performance negative for initial clients showing up in the Windows console. And then I also have a bunch of other stuff in here. A bunch of other settings to speed things up. So, like, again, the download retries. I am setting the CPU usage to be higher than normal. I think this is like 5% or something. Command polling and connection triggers tells the client to do stuff when the connection changes. Oh, resource accelerate for pending message. Whenever the machine gets a new message of something to do, it kicks it into a higher CPU usage mode. So yeah, I have a bunch of settings in here that help things out. Now, I did say that this only works on Mac and Windows with the to pre-populate the initial settings, but I actually have this tool, this little script. I wouldn't say this is quite production ready exactly, but it is incredibly valuable and incredibly useful. So it's called install bigfix.sh, and this works on Mac and Linux. It works on both. I'm just realizing, I hope you guys can see my screen. I didn't check that. Yeah, okay. Looks like you're seeing the right thing. So what this does is you run this script on a machine and you give it a relay, and that's it. That's all you give it. Is you run the script, you give it a relay. It downloads the masthead file from the relay, and then it downloads the BigFix installer from IBM directly. And then it also creates a client settings.cfg. So in here, if there's not a client settings.cfg provided, then it creates one. And then on Linux, it actually takes the client settings.cfg and morphs it into what Linux needs, which is like a bezclient.conf file or config file. So if you provide a client settings.cfg along with this script, it'll use the one you provide. If you do not provide one, then it'll make one for you with what I consider to be the right stuff, including this startup normal speed and some other stuff. And it'll populate that for you. And how it does this is somewhere in here. Here. So it reads the client settings.cfg, and then it has an awk script which turns that file into the bezclient.conf file and then puts it into place in Linux, puts it in the right spot for you, and then it starts BigFix for you, and all that jazz. It also, in this script, it opens up the firewall on Linux for port 52311 UDP. So it does that for you as well. So this whole script, it downloads the masthead, downloads the BigFix installer, and it downloads the right one for the OS that you're running it on. It sets up the client settings.cfg. It sets up the bezclient.conf file. It installs all of that. So what's amazing is you can run this, and it's very quick. It works really well. I use this for a basis of lots of other things. And then I actually have a version of this called Install BigFix Client Universal. This you can actually run on Windows, Mac, or Linux, all three, and it works on all of them. So what this does is it actually hides the command script inside of a bash script, or the other way around. So if you run this through CMD, it runs this part here. Yep, right down to through there. So it runs all that in CMD. But if you run it through bash, you actually get all of this. So this is a single script that runs both on bash and on CMD. So you can use this anywhere and it just works, which is wild that that's even possible. Martin asks, I've done a few of those settings and it does help. The problem is that we had about 250 admins created over time for various reasons, but a lot of people were removed for good. It's a way to completely delete these old admins so they're no longer evaluated. From what I've seen, they are deleted, but they still evaluated, but always false. Yeah, so this is a limitation of BigFix. There isn't really a good way to clean that up yet. I think we may be working on that in the future where you can clean this up. So that it doesn't have to go through all this. But right now, I think it's like messy and barely possible, and we may enable it to be like easier to do in the future. But 250 admins is actually a pretty small number. I mean, we have people that have thousands of them that have been deleted over time. And so, yeah, this is absolutely a negative. But the startup normal speed and the higher CPU usage, it should show up in the console pretty fast. I mean, it should be like under 5 minutes generally if things are good. I mean, at Penn State, we had 350 active console operators. Those are the ones we hadn't yet deleted. And using these settings, we got stuff showing up in BigFix pretty fast. Especially for a master operator. They'll show up for a master operator before they'll show up for the non-master operators. So, yeah, I'd be interested to hear, like, if you're using the startup normal speed and some of the other things, like how long it takes. Just do not like seeing it. Oh, okay, so you're saying it does show up quickly, you just don't like seeing it in the logs, that it's going through all this processing. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly valid, and hopefully we will address that or make it easier to address in the future. If you're in like a really bad state, like where you have like 5,000 or more, there might be something we can do. I don't know if John Talbert's team can help with that as well. But yeah, that's might be a possibility. Any other questions before I wrap things up? Any teasers for 10.0? There's some cool stuff coming, that's for sure. Don't know how much of it I can talk about on a recording. I find for non-master operators, I can take significantly longer for the client to appear based on how the permissions are applied. Yes, that's absolutely true, Jason Walker is saying. So if you're using like LDAP stuff, it may take a little bit longer. So a way to see a particular fixlet is a member of a baseline rather than checking each and every baseline. Yeah, so I mean that information. So the question is, how can I figure out what are the components of my baselines that I'm deploying? I assume without having to look through each one individually. So all that information is available in Session Relevance. And so that would actually be like an interesting dashboard or web report where you could actually like search across components of baselines and figure out where they all are, or figure out if there's duplications of components across baselines. So that is an interesting idea. There isn't, I think, a super easy way to do that right now. I do have this dashboard, which, I don't know, it doesn't show anything right now. That could be a basis of that. Oh, Jason Walker says he has something for this, because of course he does. And this baseline status results, it doesn't really show you much here, but because I don't have a baselines with failures. But if you deploy a bunch of baselines and they have failures in them, in the dropdown there would be only the list of baselines that have been deployed and have failures, and then here it would show only the components that have failures and the percentage of those failures. So it's really great for like reverse engineering, like where your problems are. And, you know, stuff you might need to analyze, especially like the fixlets and relevance and stuff like that. Jason Walker, yeah, something posted about it. Boyd says, I have Notepad++ UDL for relevance highlighting. Anyone interested in it? Yes, we're absolutely interested in that, Boyd. So you should post that on GitHub or wherever you can. Absolutely interested in that. Yeah, definitely for the forums or somewhere else. Definitely want syntax highlighting. Tips on improving accuracy or reducing the noise of OS detection when using Bez Asset Discovery. Okay, so that is interesting. Bez Asset Discovery. That is like the unmanaged asset stuff in here, and you can do a scan. Please ignore my IPs. Anyway, so you can do an unmanaged asset scan, and it uses Nmap to scan your stuff. And the OSs are not super accurate, and you can look at the OS accuracy, and it'll give you a rating. And so, like this one says 92% accurate, but I can tell you for sure I don't have this thing. So, yeah, if you're doing a scan that scans more stuff, that should make it more accurate. But the real problem here is the Nmap scanner that BigFix uses is out of date and should be updated, and that would make it way more accurate. So, I don't know, file an RFE or a PMR or all of the above and ask us to update that, and hopefully we will. There's reasons why we haven't updated it in a long time, and we've been talking about updating it, and so hopefully that will happen soon. I don't know for sure. That would be really great if we did, because it will help improve all of this stuff. But yeah, that's definitely the biggest problem, is the Nmap scanner being out of date that we are using. So sorry about that. That is our fault. That's our bad. Jonathan Spence, will BigFix patch management interfere with WSUS? Can it be used without breaking WSUS or creating issues? So that's one of the cool things about BigFix. You can deploy patches through BigFix and through other methods, and BigFix actually deploys the patch using the Windows Update agent. So you could actually use Windows Update, WSUS, and BigFix, all three of them, to patch the same system, and it should never cause a problem. That doesn't mean it definitely won't, but it's very unlikely, because all BigFix is doing the download on behalf of the machine, and then it's triggering the Windows Update agent to do the install. So if you trigger a Windows Update as a user, or through WSUS, or having BigFix do it, it's all using the same process on the system to actually do the install, and that process is like single-threaded, which means it won't allow one to install the same patch while the other patch is also being installed, and it does all the dependency handling and all that jazz. So there's actually no harm to that. At Penn State University, the way we had it set up is we would have machines configured for WSUS and for Windows Update if you were offline, if you weren't on like the corporate network, but we delivered most of our patches through BigFix. So we'd set the Windows Update stuff to check in like very rarely, and some other stuff to like limit it, so things would primarily be delivered through BigFix, and part of that was just because of the way stuff worked there. But in our labs, I think we had that disabled so that we were only pushing things through BigFix for network management reasons. So yeah, there's a bunch of different stuff around that. Yeah, so there's no real harm. I wouldn't worry about it too much. No harm in keeping it available. Was there another question? Shuffle properties and analysis without exporting and editing in Notepad++. Oh yeah, that's a really great question. I actually covered this on the London Masterclass recently. And so yeah, there is a solution to that. But yeah, I can stop the recording at some point and then talk about new features. So I'm going to make an example analysis, and then I'm going to name a property, and I'm going to name it Windows : I don't know, MAC address, something like this. And so you should, whenever you're creating a property in an analysis, you should always change the evaluate every to something longer than every report. If it's something that doesn't change often, set it to 12 hours or more. If it's something that changes frequently, maybe 30 minutes, 30 minutes to an hour, somewhere in this range. Well, this is fake, so I'm going to do once every 30 days. And then I can do MAC address. And then I can do, let's say Linux, MAC address, and stuff like this. And then I'm going to write some, really valuable relevance and hit OK. And what this does is it actually does namespacing in the console, kind of. Oh, I should have actually added some more to show how this works. And I'm going to need a computer to report back here in order to really show this. So the way it's ordered across will be the same as like the order that I added it, more or less. And I can reorder it after the fact. But if I go into where it reports in as a computer, it will actually do it alphabetically with namespacing, which is really neat. So let me add another one while I'm at it. Let's call it Windows : IP addresses. Obviously, I'm not making real relevance in here. I'm just doing this. And now I wait for a computer to report, which hopefully will be soon here. And then I can show the way it looks in the computer summary, which is really neat. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to add another one. Windows : software : installed. Let's do something like that. There we go. Hour. Okay. Refresh console. Well, any other questions while I wait on this? But generally what I would do is I'd like make an analysis as I'm like messing around creating stuff, and then when I'm like all said and done, then I would like reorder everything nicely exactly the way I want, and then use that. That's an option. Man, this where did I make this? Well, this is a really bad demo in my environment. I don't know why it's so slow right now. This should not be. Any other questions while we wait on TillDB in my environment? Any other questions? I really should have a screenshot of this so I can show this more easily. I probably do somewhere. I don't know where. Did I have my other environment up? It already has this in it. Yeah, I see what you mean. You want it to be close to an existing one. Why is this not connecting? Oh, and people often ask for a Fixlet debugger on Mac. And there is this UI that Rusty Myers at Penn State University created and open sourced, and you can actually, it just sub-processes the QnA process, which is pretty neat. How do I add content to BigFix Me? So what is the thing that you're adding for the highlighter for Notepad++? Is it just a text file? XML. Okay. Do you have a GitHub account? You might want to add it there. That'd probably be best. BigFix Me is more for sharing like fixlets and tasks. But sharing XML would probably be best. Oh, hooray, we got an answer. It says not reported. Well, whatever. That's okay. So Hyper-V. So I think this will work. At least I hope. What did I call that analysis? Example? Oh, okay. Well, whatever. Good naming. Example analysis. Hey, here we go. Perfect. This is what I want to show. So what happens is when I add these properties with this namespacing, it puts tags in tags. I don't know what Damon's saying about that. BigFix Media is funky stuff with XML. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so I made that analysis and I put the properties with this like namespacing in it where I would do something : something, and it actually like layers it in here in the results in a nice way. Whoops, that didn't work. And so obviously this isn't real results, but you see like here you have like this layer here, and then this is, well, that's not alphabetical there. I thought this was alphabetical. Maybe it's only alphabetical on this level, but not this level. So it does kind of like order it nicely and make it look nice, and you would see like the different results in here, which is really kind of cool. And this is not dependent on the ordering because I added the Linux later. So it does seem like it does some alphabetizing going on, but now I'm confused as to why S and then I and then M. So maybe it doesn't alphabetize at the later layers. I don't even understand how that works, actually. But this is something that like I didn't know about, and like I don't even remember how I found this out. Like maybe someone told me about it, or I saw an example somewhere, and I wasn't sure why they were using the colons that way, and I thought it was weird. And then I looked here, and I was like, "Oh my god, it's doing something totally different. That's amazing." So yeah, it's it's like an undocumented namespacing feature for property names, which is pretty cool. I'd strongly recommend using this. I mean, this isn't a good example because you probably wouldn't do Linux, Mac, and Windows separately like this in different properties, but you know, get the idea. All right, let me stop the recording. How do I do this? Okay, stop. How do I stop? I could pause. All right, pause.